And I have made a few modifications with this render. I ended up moving the camera a little bit, and I also made a couple of modifications just to the ecosystem. I've taken all the broadleaf variations, the broadleaf straight trunk species, and have decreased the scale. With my renders, I ended up with having those a little too large. So I have reduced the scale of those, and I also removed the gnarl variation, one of the gnarly vegetation species. I've replaced that with a different plant, just because those were showing up as a little too bright green, and rather than having to do too much post work or go back and modify the plant itself, I just ended up replacing it. But you can see a pretty good distribution of the ecosystem. So we have a pretty versatile scene here. We'd be able to pretty much move anywhere in the terrain and have a really nice distribution set up. And overall, I think it looks pretty good. It could definitely use a little bit of work, maybe to the material, since there's no bump map on the terrain itself. We're just using the procedural. So as we got closer to the terrain, we would want to have some sort of bump map for the grass and the rock. And if we take a look at a farther away render, we can see a lot more of the distribution matching the images that we had rendered out earlier. And if I was to spend any more time on this, one thing I would definitely do is make another affinity with layer, ecosystem layer, just above layer 2 or layer 1 even, and just kind of have some sparse plants throughout the more open, grassier areas. And I've only done a tiny little bit of post work on this image and the other render, primarily just the coloration. Sometimes it's easier just to modify the color in post, but that's primarily with stills. Once you get into animation, it might be easier to modify the species and get the color a little closer to what you want, and then minimize the post work, really depending on the tools you have available for animated post work. So if you wanted to modify the scene further, maybe modify the lighting or make any changes to the scene that way, any of the render settings, then what you could do is create a new group if you wanted to make atmosphere changes and save out the atmosphere, those render settings, and bring them into this scene in this group. That way you have a little more control. You could make maybe another terrain zone, focus in just on a specific area. Since we are using dynamic population, if the camera is really close to just a small section of the terrain, then it's only going to render the plants within view and not outside of the camera view. So that's one of the main benefits of dynamic population, is you don't have all these instances hogging your system resources if they're not needed. I'm going to load in the last variation of the scene I've created, landscape D6, and you might not have all of these variations just because I did save a couple of steps on the way with a few modifications. Taking a look at the scene and the landscape, we can see the changes that I've made to the ecosystem, really reducing the broadleafs on Eco 1, broadleafs on Eco 2, where I replaced the gnarly trees with broadleafs, and one of the variations I created, I've got the scale down to 0.4 because they were just way too large.